Welcome to this session on digital photography. Today we will discuss aperture, shutter speed and ISO. Have you ever wondered why some of your pictures look too dark or too light? That is because of underexposure or overexposure. Exposure is the amount of light a digital camera's sensor captures when a photo is taken. Too much light results in a washed-out photo, which is called overexposed. Too little light and the photo will be too dark, underexposed. A camera's aperture, shutter speed and ISO settings directly affect exposure. More importantly, they allow you to control how each photo will look. In this session, we will discuss each of these terms and explain how they will affect your picture when operating in manual mode. Exposure. Exposure is the amount of light a digital camera's sensor captures when a photo is taken. The light reflected from the objects or scene outside the camera travels through the camera lens and falls on the light sensitive part of the digital camera, which is called the sensor. When the camera is focused on a subject, an image is formed on the light sensitive surface. Digital cameras use an image sensor instead of film for the exposure. The pixels on the image sensor converts the exposed light into electrical charge, which is electronically processed and stored in a digital image file for later display or processing. There are three kinds of exposures. 1. Underexposure. It can be defined as to expose photographic film or sensor to light for too short a time or to light that is insufficient to produce normal image contrast. We experience underexposure when the camera sensor is not receiving enough light to record the images. An underexposed image looks too dark. Overexposure. It can be defined as to expose a photographic film or sensor too long or with too much light. We experience overexposure when the camera receives too much light to record the images. An image which is brighter than it should be is considered as overexposed. Perfect or correct exposure. Perfect exposure is the industry standard of what a photograph should be. The shadows and highlights in the image will look natural and comfortable in a correctly exposed photograph. All the areas in the image will be clear with full details. It will be a balanced one between an overexposed and underexposed image. Controlling exposure using aperture, shutter speed and ISO. The aperture of a camera is located behind the glass lens of a camera. This is an adjustable iris diaphragm behind the lens that determines the size of the hole that allows the light into the camera. The size of the aperture is indicated by its f-stop and is the ratio between the diameter of the lens opening and the focal length of the lens. The aperture works like the pupil in our eye. In darker places, it needs to open wider, and in brighter places, it needs to contract. The shutter of a camera is located in the body of the camera behind the aperture and in front of the surface that captures the image. The shutter determines how long the image sensor is exposed to the light from the scene being photographed and is measured in fractions of a second. For instance, A shutter speed of 250 means that the image sensor has been exposed to light for 1/250th of a second. ISO is the level of sensitivity of the camera sensor to available light. The lower the ISO number, the less sensitivity is to light, while the higher the ISO number, the higher the sensitivity of the camera sensor. The component within the camera that is sensitive to light is called image sensor or simply sensor. It is the most important and most expensive part of a camera and is responsible for gathering light and transforming it into an image. With increased sensitivity, the camera sensor can capture images in low light environments without having to use a flash. But higher sensitivity adds grain or noise to the picture. Aperture. The role of aperture or f-stop number. One of the most confused terms in a DSLR camera is the aperture or the f-stop number. The size of the aperture or f-stop number determines how much light enters the camera. Generally, when someone speaks about f-stop, he or she is referring to aperture, the terms being used interchangeably. The f-stop on a lens can go from 1.2 to 22 or sometimes even higher. It is important to understand the role of aperture in photography. The f-stop number signifies the lens opening. The wider the opening of the lens, the greater the amount of light that enters the camera. The smaller the opening of the lens, the lesser the amount of light that enters the camera. How to understand f-stop reading? F-stops are expressed in fractions. The larger the f-stop numbers, the smaller the lens opening. The smaller the f-stop number, the larger the lens opening. So, a f-stop of 8 means that less light gets into the camera than an f-stop of 2. So, what is the relationship between aperture and the f-stop setting? If the aperture opens wider to allow more light, the f-stop setting gets smaller and vice versa. F-stop number and depth of field. Depth of field is the amount of space that is in focus both in front of and behind the exact point at which the camera lens is focused. The larger the lens opening, the smaller the depth of field, and the smaller the lens opening, the larger the depth of field. When the depth of field is less, it is called shallow focus. When the depth of field is more, it is called deep focus, shallow focus. When the aperture is large, example f1.8, the area that is in focus in front of and behind the point where the camera is focused is less. That means objects right in front of and right behind the plane of focus is out of focus. Shallow focus is used primarily to isolate the subject from its environment, and it is used a lot in portrait work, macro photography and sports and advertising photography. Deep focus. When the aperture is small, example f16, the image has a large depth of field. This means that the focus range covers a large area in front and behind the focused plane. Large depth of field is most often associated with landscape photography, but we can also see it in architectural photography. Shutter speed. Role of shutter speed in photography. If we look at the photograph of a moving bus on the road, sometimes that image may look blurry. It is because the picture has been shot with the low shutter speed of the camera. The shutter determines how long the image sensor is exposed to light from the scene being photographed and is measured in fractions of a second. For instance, a shutter speed of 100 means that the image sensor has been exposed to light for 1/100th of a second. The higher the shutter speed, the shorter the image sensor is exposed to light. The lower the shutter speed, the longer the camera is exposed to light. For instance, a shutter speed of 250 means the shutter is open for 1/250th of a second and is best suited for catching normal motion in a brief moment of time. A shutter speed of 80 means the shutter is open for 1/80th of a second, which may blur an object or person in action due to the long exposure. How to blur or freeze motion with your camera? A fast shutter speed will freeze action, whereas a slow shutter speed can create a blurred effect. When you set your shutter speed on your camera, you will see numbers like 60, 120, 250, 1000 and so on. These actually represent 1/60th of a second, 1/120th of a second and so on. So, the higher the bottom number in the fraction, the faster the shutter speed. The smaller the number, the slower the shutter speed. You will also see shutter speeds for seconds indicated by inch marks. For example, if the display says 1.5 inches, that indicates a shutter speed of 1.5 seconds. When the shutter speed is increased, the exposure of the image sensor to light is decreased because the shutter is moving faster. This allows your camera to freeze the motion. When the shutter speed is decreased, the exposure of the image sensor to the light is increased because the shutter is moving slower. This allows your camera to blur the motion. Fast moving objects will need a faster shutter speed, around 1/1000 of a second or higher, in order to freeze the subject in action. The relationship between shutter speed and aperture. Shutter speed and aperture control the light that enters the camera. While shutter speed determines how long the image sensor is exposed to light, the aperture determines how much light is let into the image sensor. For example, when you increase shutter speed to take a freeze photograph of a moving object, less light enters to the camera. So, you must compensate it by increasing the opening of the aperture. Thus, there is a relationship between the two. When you decrease the shutter speed, you must increase your f-stop and vice versa, so that proper exposure is made. It works like a seesaw. When one side goes up, the other side must go down by equal amount. Starting at the equilibrium of f8 and 1/125th, you can increase the f-stop by 2 levels to f16, but that makes the shutter reading decrease by 2 steps, that is 1/30th. If you do not compensate for your change in f-stop or shutter speed, then you overexpose or underexpose your picture. Exposure triangle. Now, let us put these 3 exposure related functions together and talk about the exposure triangle. Exposure triangle is made up of ISO, aperture and shutter speed. These 3 elements independently or together control the exposure of the photographs we take. The aperture controls the quantity of light or how much light is coming into the camera. It is the small opening in the camera lens. If the aperture is wide open, more light enters the camera, and if the aperture is decreased, less light enters the camera. Shutter speed determines how long the light enters the camera. If the shutter speed is really fast, not much light enters the camera, and if the shutter speed is very slow, more light enters the camera. The third element in the exposure triangle is ISO. The ISO signifies the sensitivity of the camera sensor to light. If your camera has a low ISO number like 100 or 200, the camera is not very sensitive to light, and so you have to open up your aperture or opt for a slow shutter speed. And if you increase your ISO, your camera becomes more sensitive to light, and as a result we get noise in the image. Achieving a correct exposure using the aperture, shutter speed and ISO is a juggling act. As soon as you make a decision about one element, you will need to compromise with another. So, for getting these three elements balanced, there is a built-in option called metering on every modern camera. The meter will look at the settings of your camera and judge correct aperture, ISO and shutter speed for you. Now, let us conclude this session on aperture, ISO and shutter speed. Exposure is the correct amount of light that falls upon the image sensor of a camera and creates the image to the desired effect. You have understood the basics of how the camera works and how to control each of the exposure related functions like aperture, shutter speed and ISO. In this module, we have given you a real demonstration of how the exposure triangle works, that is, how the aperture, shutter speed and ISO work in conjunction to get the right exposure, and how each of these things affect each other. We also learned how to take photographs in shallow focus and deep focus by varying aperture settings. We recognized how to capture freeze motion and blur motion photographs by changing shutter speed settings. Hopefully, by the end of this session, you will be confident in your understanding of shutter speeds, aperture settings and how they relate to each other. Before we move on to the next session, please try to answer the following questions. 1. Operate your camera in shutter priority mode, often indicated with an S or TV on your camera dial. Don't worry about aperture, as the camera will take care of that for you. Use a glass vase turned upside down in your kitchen sink. Place the vase directly under the faucet and turn the water on for a splash. Take two photographs, one in a fast shutter speed and the other in a slow shutter speed. Analyze the results. 2. Operate your camera in aperture priority mode, often indicated with an A or an AV on your camera dial. Don't worry about shutter speed, as the camera will take care of that for you. Find a fixed subject such as a flower, a tree branch, etc. and take two photographs, one in shallow focus and the other in deep focus. Analyze the results. Now we provide you with some references for your further reading. Image Sensors and Signal Processing for Digital Still Camera by Nakamura I, published by CRC Press, Boca Raton, USA. Complete Digital Photography, Practical Tips on Technique, Printing and Presentation by Ang Tong, published by New Holland Publishers, London. The Manual of Photography, 10th edition by Ellen Elizabeth and Sophie Trianta Philidu, published by Taylor and Francis, New York. Thank you for listening to this session on aperture, shutter speed and ISO. In the upcoming sessions, you will learn more about digital photography. Until then, goodbye.